So I first learned about the Nisga'a totem pole almost 5 years ago when I went to visit my chief, and in our language we call him Ts'aawit Nisga'a. And I'd actually gone over to his house for a different purpose. I was doing some research on Nisga'a language revitalization, and I'd found some sensitive spiritual information on our house, and I thought I should go share it with him and ask him what I should do with it. And upon hearing that I was engaging in a research project and I had grant funding, he started telling me about our totem pole. And the Nisga'a totem pole, there was an original one that he knew had been stolen and was sitting in Scotland. And so he'd asked me to find out more information about the pole, its exact location, and a little bit more information about one of the names that was attached to the pole, because we were going to be having a feast in 4 months' time, and he wanted to be able to give that name out at the feast. In addition to that, he also asked me if he could use some of that grant funding to help raise a new totem pole. And of course, I had to tell him that that funding was already earmarked. But I went away and I did listen to what he said. And he'd also said that at one point in history, not too long ago, prior to the ratification of the Nisga'a Final Agreement, that we did have a delegation go to Scotland, and they went into the museum where the totem pole is located, and they'd asked for it to have it returned. And at that time, the museum officials had actually told them that the pole was too old to be moved. And so when I went away and I started doing a little bit more research on the pole, I discovered that it was sitting in the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh. And since that first delegation had gone there, they had moved the pole. And in fact, they had moved the pole 3 times in the entire history it was there. And so that made me really angry. And so I went back to Ts'aawit Nisga'a and I said, why don't we write a grant, and why don't we see if we can go over there and we can bring it home? And so I partnered with our local village government in the Nisga'a Nation, the Lakwasat village government, and that's what we did. And so we successfully received a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada Shirk Exploration Grant. And it enabled us to support the carving of a new totem pole, which we ultimately passed along to another house through our hereditary system. But then it also enabled us to form a delegation and go to Scotland and to let the government of Scotland, as well as the National Museums of Scotland, know that we wanted our pole returned to us. Prior to going to Scotland, I did a lot of research and a lot of background details and preparation. But we also assembled a really great team that came with us. So it wasn't just me and Ts'aawit Nisga'a, but we also brought with us a team of people who had just amazing talents and gifts that supported our negotiations. And so we were joined by Donald Leeson, Pamela Brown, Andrew Robinson, Teresa Schober, Shauna McKay, and myself. And I can say that when we first walked into the National Museums of Scotland, we went with much uncertainty, but we also went with even more determination. And I truly believe that we went with one of the greatest gifts that we have as Nisga'a peoples. And we went with our hearts and our minds working together as one. And I can see that through the entire journey that we've been fully guided by the spirit of my ancestral grandmother, who had this actual totem pole commissioned. And I saw her bring together the right team of people. And every kind of twist and turn that we encountered in our negotiations, and in even just trying to technically bring this totem pole across the pond here back to Canada, she was there in terms of helping us move through some of those barriers. But when we did first arrive, that first time in August of 2022 on the doorsteps of the National Museums of Scotland, so we expressed to the National Museum of Scotland's board, as well as to Mr. Robertson, who was the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution of External Affairs and Culture for the Government of Scotland, that our reason for going to Scotland was actually quite simple, right? It was very simple. We wanted our children to wake up every day and not have to work so hard to learn the stories of who we are. And we wanted them to be able to do that with every breath that they take. So we spoke to them that day about the troubling imperial and colonial history that we have all inherited, but we all have the future to change. We also cited important legislation that supported our desire to have the pole returned to us, and of course of most significance to our case. And I do have an article in the Canadian Museums Association that speaks a little bit more in depth about that. But we did cite the Nisga'a Final Agreement, which was a self-governance treaty between Canada, British Columbia, and our nation. Specifically, we had Chapter 17 that supports the repatriation of Nisga'a cultural treasures and belongings. And in addition to that, I think the other really big piece of important international legislation was the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We voiced our assertions to the Government of Scotland that we were a self-governing nation, so that actually made us quite unique in terms of that negotiation process, and that we did not need Canada or British Columbia with us on that trip. However, of course, we were very appreciative of their support to help us get that totem pole home since that time. But we'd done our research, as I mentioned, prior to arriving on those doorsteps. So I had began attending several conferences in the UK, specifically around critical museum studies, in order to begin building solidarity with folks who specialize in the field. Because again, I don't have a PhD in totem pole rematriation. I'd also wrote a book chapter with one of our respected chiefs, and his name was Ts'aawit Duke, and his English name is Chief William Moore. And he still holds the oral memory of that pole theft. And so we wrote a book chapter that was published in a critical Scottish book, Scottish Transnationalisms. And that book chapter we also used as part of our claim for the permanent transfer of the totem pole, in addition to the oral testimony that we provided to the museum that day. But in terms of some of the oral research that we did, so our rematriation story begins somewhere in the 1860s and the 1870s when our ancestral grandmother, Joanna Moody, had the Nisga'a Memorial Pole commissioned. We know that she had the pole carved to honor Ts'aawit, and Ts'aawit was a fallen warrior. And when you actually look at our totem pole, you can see his name being carved in a crest on the pole, and it's the raven crest on the bottom. And I actually carry the female version of that name. But we know that she would have commissioned Oye, who was a prolific carver at that time, and that Joanna undertook her leadership in a time of duress. And so what that meant for us as Nisga'a peoples is that she would have undertook leadership in one of the most significant times of genocide that we would have ever really experienced as Nisga'a peoples. And she had to have this pole commissioned in a time of deep grief for a family member. But we also know that she did the right thing. She did the right thing for our house and for our family. And like I mentioned, we have continued to feel her spirit guiding us in our entire journey in order to bring the pole home. I guess another point to consider in terms of some of the oral research and some of the written research on the project was that I also initially started using the term repatriation, and I did it in an unconscious way. And as I began to look into our lineage and look into the story of Joanna and think about the fact that we are a matrilineal society, and so that means if your mother is Nisga'a, you are Nisga'a, and our lineage is traced that way, then that term repatriation really doesn't apply to us. And of course, as my knowledge of museum practices deepened, I also recognize that repatriation processes are often steeped in patriarchal and paternalistic Eurocentric practices, laws, and policies. And so we were very clear in our claim to the National Museums of Scotland that the return of the Nisga'a pole must centre Nisga'a laws, Nisga'a knowledge, and ways of being. We recognize that our matriarchs hold leadership roles that are to be in balance with our respected chiefs and, of course, our beloved family members in our houses, our clans, and our nation in order to support our governance needs. And as I began to think further on the term rematriation, I also recognize that it is an ongoing process for us due to the colonial harms caused by settler colonialism. And of course, it's a process where we welcome our men, our two-spirit, and our gender-diverse folks in order to help us redress some of the imbalances caused by colonialism. So when we first went to Scotland in 2022, we shared that Marius Barbeau, the colonial ethnographer who stole our pole, did so without our permission. And I think one of the really helpful things about his research, although most of it was quite harmful, was that he was a very well-documented researcher and he took extensive field notes. And so it didn't take very long to find that he had documented that he had been given permission by the government of Canada in order to have our pole removed from our ancient village of Ankida. And interestingly enough, it was actually Duncan Campbell Scott himself who had signed off on those orders. Of course, we know now that Canada never had that permission. And so we let the people of Scotland know that we wanted the spirit of this pole to be free in our motherlands where it belonged. In our oral testimony, we also told the National Museums of Scotland that we expected that we wanted our pole returned without conditions, no conditions to our house and to the National Museums of Scotland, and that we expected our Nisga'a, which is our law and our protocols, to be centered and respected, rather than following a procedure that was dictated by Scottish law. We had reviewed the National Museums of Scotland's what they would call their repatriation policy. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's called the Procedure for Considering Requests for the Permanent Transfer or Collection of Objects to Non-UK Claimants. And after reviewing it, we explained to them that it wasn't relevant for our discussion. And we explained that we weren't just talking about semantics, but we saw that there were fundamental differences in terms of the ontological and the epistemological differences in understanding the living and the spiritual nature of a pole And that was shared so eloquently that day by our leadership who was in the room. We explained that sacred belongings are not museum objects that can be owned, and that a museum procedures only relate to belongings as property. And so we provided evidence that the pole was more than an object, it was more than property, or more than a cultural artifact, and it couldn't be owned or controlled by a museum. So we left Scotland with a lot of uncertainty. So we agreed to wait 3 months for the board to come to a final decision. And that was a huge concession for me because I went to Scotland and we went into our negotiations expecting that we would have a decision within 3 days. And it was our own delegation who told me to slow down just a little bit. And so over the course of that time, we returned to Canada. We did have to get a lawyer involved and to finalize some of our last stages of our negotiations. But I'm grateful that on December 1st of 2022, we did learn that the pole would be returned to us. And I think it took me almost a week in order to process the news and to really let it sink in. And there's been so many people that have helped us and have stepped in to do the right thing. But most specifically, I think my proudest memory of the project, and now I'm going to cry, was when we uncrated the pole and having our children be able to witness it for the first time. You know, it had only been me and Simon Fraser and my cousin Shauna who'd ever saw the pole as ancestors in this lifetime. And so when we brought that pole back to the Nass, it was the first time our nation and our children could see it. And I felt my spirit was at peace, knowing that our children had another story to tell about this pole, right? We have more than one story to tell about this pole and its strength to come home and how it got brought home. So